Hey everyone, welcome to Lesson 1 in our LOTR Converter app. Now, this lesson is called Lesson 1, but really there was a prerequisite lesson that I called Lesson 0 that you should watch before this if you haven't already. In this lesson, we're going to create and set up our project in Xcode, and I'll show you how you can sign into Xcode with your Apple ID, which you'll need to do before you can publish your apps to the App Store. Then I'll give you a quick tour of Xcode and explain how we'll use it to build our apps throughout this course. And part of that is checking out the app preview that Xcode provides so we can see how our app looks in real time as we build it. And last, we'll add the app icon and we'll add some images to our project so we can use them during the development process. Let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is open up Xcode. If you don't have Xcode yet, then you need to go back and watch the video on downloading and installing Xcode to your computer. And then it'll either be on your dock like I have here, or it will be in your Launchpad. So open that up, and then it should launch with this welcome screen. And if for some reason your Xcode doesn't show this screen, you can open it up by going up here, and make sure you're really running Xcode, and then go to Window, and then Welcome to Xcode. Now I'm just going to say this one more time. Check to make sure your version is Xcode 16 or above. If you're running a lower version of Xcode like 15 or 14, then I would highly recommend upgrading to the latest version, because the iOS 18 and SwiftUI 6 stuff only works on Xcode 16 and later. So with that in mind, the first thing we want to do here is create a new Xcode project. So click on that. And then Xcode wants us to do a few setup steps. We're building an iOS app, so make sure iOS and app are selected and click Next. Now this screen here is where you fill in your app information. I'm going to go through this in detail for this app, and then for future apps we'll just kind of blaze through this screen. So let's start at the top. Product name is the name of your app, but it's not necessarily the name that's going to appear on the App Store or on the user's phone screen. So don't get stuck on this product name for too long. I'm just going to put LOTR Converter. For team, it's going to look a little different depending on if you've signed into Xcode before. If this is the first time you're using Xcode, then it'll have this option to add an account. Now all this is, if we click on this, is it just wants you to sign in with your Apple ID. Now you don't have to do this. Let me say that again. You don't have to sign in. You can build your project just fine without signing in. But if you want to publish your apps to the App Store, or even test your apps on your physical device, then you will have to sign in eventually. And there's nothing to worry about if you don't sign in right now. You can always do it later. But just to show you how it's done, I'm going to go ahead and sign into mine. And they do say, if you don't have an Apple ID, it's free to set one up. So type that in, and I'm going to block mine out so you can't see it. Next. And then do your password. Next. And now we're signed in. Now again, you don't need to do this right now, but I just wanted to walk through those steps just to show you. And if you do sign in right now, you won't need to do this again for future projects, so once you get to this point, you should be good. But before we close our Xcode settings, while we're in here anyways, there's a couple more things I want to quickly show you. Go ahead and click through each of these tabs just to kind of get familiar with the Xcode settings. But the ones I want to talk about right now are themes. And this is where you can just decide how your Xcode looks. Now for me right now, I have Presentation Dark. And that makes the code a little bit bigger so that as I record these lessons, it's easier to see. And you can go ahead and click through all these, and the one I usually like is Default Dark. So it's kind of similar to Presentation Dark, except it's a lot smaller, so there's a lot more code that can fit on the screen. And I'll just leave mine on Presentation Dark for these lessons. The other things is text editing. I like to show the line numbers, and also the code folding ribbon. And then everything else is the default, and you can do whatever ones you want. Then we have editing, And the only one I want to call out here is predictive code completion. Now, this requires macOS 15 or higher running on a device with at least 16 gigabytes of RAM or higher. So this is one of those features where a lot of people are going to be able to activate it and have it, but a lot of people won't, at least at first. People with older Macs and less RAM just won't be able to use this. Now, that's not going to affect our course, so don't worry about that right now, but it probably is going to be helpful for those who do have it. So just kind of keep that in mind, that those minimum requirements are there for that feature. And obviously, if you can have it, I'd recommend just having that turned on. Everything else looks good. Indentation. There's just one thing in here I want to change, and that is to enable re-indent on paste. Sometimes when you paste code, it gets all out of alignment, so this just lets us skip the step of re-indenting everything manually. Key bindings. We're not going to change anything here, but still look through that sometime and get familiar with the keyboard shortcuts we can do with Xcode. And I'll be using some of those and showing you what those are as we go through the projects. And then the rest of these, again, just kind of look through everything to get familiar with it. And then when you're done with that, we can close out of these Xcode settings and go back to our app setup. And now, remember what we were doing in here, our team area looks different. We can select no team, none, which is what it would automatically do if we didn't sign in, or we can select the account we just signed into, and we might as well do that. For the organization identifier, it doesn't really matter what you put as long as it's unique to you. But the common practice is to set it to your website backwards. See, it even has this little example for us right here. It says com.yourcompany, and then the product name that we gave, so LOTR converter. Now, if you don't have a website, don't worry, because it doesn't actually matter what you put here. My website is kjapps.com, so I'm going to put for my organization identifier com.kjapps. And you can see that bundle identifier updated. Now, for those watching this lesson, don't do com.kjapps because it's supposed to be unique to you. If you have a website, just do your website backwards like I did. But if you don't have a website, just enter in com.literally anything. It could be com.the name of your pet, or com.your name, or your last name, or your middle name. It really doesn't matter. Just do com.something, and yeah, it should be something unique to you. For interface, we're going to be doing SwiftUI. The old interface is Storyboard, and I won't talk too much about that since we're not going to use it in this course, but just so you're aware, Storyboard is just Apple's old way of designing screens and building your app. And then since we did SwiftUI, the only language option we have is Swift. Now, just for fun, I guess, change the interface to Storyboard, and then we have another language option, Objective-C, which, like Storyboard, is just Apple's old way of doing things. It's their old programming language that everyone used before Swift. Now trust me, if you've never seen Objective-C, it's a lot harder to learn than Swift. So it's really nice that Apple continues to make their tools easier to use for developers. Let's go ahead and change our interface back to SwiftUI, and then it automatically changes our language back to Swift. Now for the testing system, before we changed the language to Objective-C, this was actually set to Swift testing by default. And then when we changed our language to Objective-C, it changed it to this older one, XCTest. Now for this app, we're actually going to do none, because we don't need to worry about the testing system on this one. Now for storage. Mine is set to none. But if we open this up, the options are none, Swift data, and core data. Now I'm not going to talk about these right now because for this app, we're just using none. But we will come back and talk about Swift data and core data later in a different app. And then this checkbox here is only active if we select a storage system, so we don't need to worry about that. So finally, let's click Next. Now Xcode wants to know where we want to save our project. And you can save it wherever you want, But for mine, I'm just going to go to Desktop, and I'm going to create a new folder for my app projects. Create. And then one more thing in here, uncheck this source control git repository box, if you don't know what it is. If you do know what it is and you want to leave it checked, go ahead and do that. But I'm not going to talk about this until a later section. So for this app, I'm going to leave it unchecked. And click Create. So that builds for a sec. And I'm just going to maximize my Xcode window here. And now we can see all of our default stuff that Xcode gives us for every new project. But before we get started actually looking at our app, I want to give you a quick tour of Xcode for those who haven't used it. If you already know how to navigate Xcode and where to find all the stuff we're going to need, go ahead and skip ahead to the end of the Xcode tour. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the main area, which is the code, and then the preview right here. You can probably see I have limited screen space, so the first thing I want to show you is over here on the preview side. And this is where you can see how your app looks in real time as we write our code. Now, we don't get a preview in every file, because not every file is about something we see on the screen. Some code files are going to be all about the data behind the scenes, or maybe we're going to have a file for some sort of networking that we're doing to access the internet in the background. And if you want to see an example of a file that doesn't show the preview, we can open up this LOTR converter app file. This is a really small file that is actually just the main entrance to our app. So when we run this app on our phone or our simulator, it's going to be looking for this @main keyword. And that's how it knows this is the file that kind of starts up our app. But again, there's no preview for this file, so the preview section went away. But then we go back to our content view, and the preview comes back. But another thing is, we don't actually have to have a preview in here either. The thing that's telling Xcode to show us this preview is this preview code down here at the bottom. If we get rid of this, then there we go, the preview goes away again. Now obviously we want the preview, so just Command-Z to undo that, and our preview is back. So let's talk about some of the stuff over here. First of all, we have our phone screen here, and by default it usually shows the device that you have selected up here at the top. So this is our iPhone 16 Pro. Now I don't know how yours looks, but you can see on mine, the iPhone is way too big for my screen. And the way to fix that is to go down to these sizing options here, and I like to do this third one. If you hover over it, it says Zoom to Fit. So I'm going to click on that, and then the preview zooms to fit my screen so that I can see the whole thing. And now if I resize this section here, the preview gets smaller or bigger depending on the space that I give it. And if you make it small enough, you notice that those 4 zoom options disappeared, and now they're all behind this one button here. And you can try out those other options if you want. I'm going to leave mine on Zoom to Fit. And sometimes if you go to other files and come back, then you have to reselect your settings over here. So we'll probably see that happen as we go through the apps. Now over here we have some other options. And we'll look at some of this later when we're actually using it. But just a couple of main things I want you to understand right now is mostly just these 2 options here. Right now, we're running the preview in live mode. What live mode means is that the preview is actually running our app live right now, and we can interact with it, just like when it's running on our simulator or our phone. And let's quickly add a button to our code so I can show you how that looks. So just right under this text view here, let's say button, and then parentheses, and then we'll just say quotes, button, end quote. And then we need to do curly braces. And press enter, and it will automatically do our closing curly brace. Now that's all we need for now. The button doesn't do anything, but that's fine because I just want to show you that our preview, when it's in live mode, is actually really running our app. Or at least I should be more specific, it's running the section of our app that we put in the preview code. So it's running the content view. And if you noticed, that button appeared there on the preview when we typed it in the code. And now let's just try clicking on that button. See, it's responding to our clicks, like a real app. So that's live mode. The next one right here is called selectable mode. Let's try this one. So a couple things changed a little bit. One is this blue line showed up around our button. And if we try tapping the button, it doesn't respond to the tap anymore. But it does highlight our button code over here. Let's try clicking on our text. Now the blue line moves up here and it highlights our text code. And same if we tap on our image. Now we won't be using selectable mode as often as live mode, but it's nice to use from time to time when we're trying to see how much space our views are using or how they affect each other's position. For example, let's add some space around this image. So just go right under that foreground style. And the first thing you're going to notice on mine is it puts that font title line there for us. But it's kind of transparent because it's not actually there yet. It's only a suggestion. And this happens because I turned on predictive code completion. Remember I talked about that in the Xcode settings? It was one of those boxes we could check. So this is using Apple Intelligence, which is just Apple's fancy way of saying AI, to predict what I want to add. And if you have predictive code completion turned on, then yours might be suggesting a totally different line. And then if you don't have it turned on, then obviously you won't be seeing anything. And again, I mentioned you don't need predictive code completion during this course, because I'll make sure to tell you all the code we're typing. But as you move forward beyond this course and you start making your own apps, then it might be nice to have this capability. So that's why I turned it on, so I could show you how it works, but again, you don't need it for this course. Now the way you apply the suggested code is to just hit the tab key. And I'm not going to do that because that's actually not what we're going to write, but just so you know, the tab key is how you insert predictive code. So remember, we're trying to add space around our image, so we go down here below the foreground style, and let's type dot. Make sure you don't forget the dot, it's important. So dot, and then padding with empty parentheses. Now look how big the blue box is. The blue line, the blue box there, isn't part of our view. It's just included in selectable mode to show us where our view is at and how much space it takes. So with some padding around the image, the entire image view takes up a lot more space, even though the image itself is still the same size. And then we can go back to live mode, and the blue box goes away, but you can see that the image is still kind of far away from the text because of that padding we added. And the button works again. So again, live mode is the default, and that's what we'll mostly be using. But selectable mode can be really helpful for certain situations. Now let's bring our attention over and talk about the code section. This section is kind of self-explanatory since it's just where we type our code, but there are a couple things I want to point out. Now depending on your Xcode settings, you might see a little mini-map over here on the right, just like I have here. Now this is a lot more helpful on longer code files. If you bring your mouse over here, you can hover over different parts and it will show you the different parts of our code. And I like to have this here generally, but for these recordings, and for you if you have limited screen space too, the way to turn that on and off, let me just show you real quick. You go up here to Editor and just click Minimap. And it goes away. And then if you want to bring it back, you just do the same thing, Editor, Minimap. Now one useful thing is at the top of our code section here is basically just where we're at in the project, and even where we're at in the file, in the code. So you can see we're in the LOTR converter project, and then the folder with the same name, and we're in the content view file, and we're in this body section here. If we click on this content view, now it changes to say we're in the content view. So that's pretty nice. And we can even navigate from here. So we can click here, for example, and then say, I want to go to the assets. And this is where we're going to bring in our app icon and our images, but we'll do that in a minute after our Xcode tour. So back in the content view, that is basically our code section. And again, these code line numbers and the code folding ribbon is what we activated in the Xcode settings when we were first setting up the project. The next section of Xcode I want to talk about is this panel over here on the left. This is called the Navigator. And you can see at the top here, we have a bunch of different tabs. And if we hover over the tabs, we can see that this here is the Project Navigator, the Source Control Navigator, the Bookmark Navigator, and so forth. Now the Project Navigator is the one that's open right now. And this is where we can view and work with our project files. So if we click through these different files, we can see all the stuff that Xcode creates for a new iOS app project. Most of the time we'll just be in our code files just writing code. But another really important file is the blue project file at the top here. This is where we can view and change our project settings. Now before we saw Xcode settings, so that's different. These ones right here are going to be specific to this project. So we have project here, and we won't do much in here. And then we have targets. So click on that. And this is kind of where we have our app settings. So we can see our app is automatically going to work for all these devices. And we could add more devices if we wanted to, like Apple Watch, Apple TV. We have the iOS version we're building for, iOS 18, and then a bunch of other stuff. And we'll go through some of this later. Now, one thing we do need to actually go and change is, see how we're in General here? We need to go to Build Settings, and then make sure Basic is selected, and scroll down till you get to Swift Language Version here. Remember, this course is about Swift 6, but when you create a new project, Apple automatically sets it to Swift 5. Now the reason they do that is because Swift 6 actually breaks a ton of existing code. So a lot of people will start their projects with a template or a framework that already has a bunch of existing code, and a lot of that code just doesn't work with Swift 6 yet because it's so new. So they have to set it to Swift 5. But we're going to do Swift 6, so just change that, and then we should be good to go. So back to our content view, and we were talking about the navigators here. And if we click through these other navigators, then you can kind of start getting familiar with some of the different ways we can view and work with our project. Now, I won't explain all of these right now, but as we use them throughout this course, I'll make sure to explain what we're doing and how each of these work as we need to use them for our projects. For this app, and actually for all of our apps, we'll be working mostly in the Project Navigator. So just make sure you've got that open, and I'm actually going to resize this down just a little bit, because for recording I really do need all the possible space I can get for my code area. And that's it for navigators. The next section I want to talk about is this top part here, just this small part. Over here on the left, right above the navigator section, is the play button or the run button, which is how we run our app on the simulator to get an idea of how it runs on a real iPhone. And over here in the middle is where we can choose which simulator we want to use. And we have simulators for all the latest Apple devices. Now, if you remember my video on downloading and installing Xcode, I only selected to install iOS, and then macOS was required, so that one was automatically selected, but I left all the other ones unchecked. If you checked any of those other options, then you'll see a lot more devices here, like Apple Watch, Apple TV, Vision Pro, and so forth. But for me, I only see iPhones and iPads. And I like to test my apps on the latest iPhone. So I'm going to make sure iPhone 16 Pro is selected as my simulator. Alright, one more thing. Let's talk about this panel over here. This is called the Inspector. And kind of like the Navigator section, we can hover over these to see all the different inspectors we have. So here we have the File Inspector. And if we open that up, we see that it just gives us some more detailed information about the file we have open, which right now is our content view. It gives us the full name, including the file type, which is .swift, and it even gives us the full path of where this file is stored on our Mac. And it shows us other things like target and text settings, and we don't really need to know a lot about this other stuff. But again, as we go through the course and we need to use these different sections, I'll explain it in more detail. We have a history inspector, A quick help inspector, this one's actually really nice. Right now it's not showing much, but watch what happens if we click on something in our code, like the image. Now it gives us a detailed explanation of what an image is and what you can do with an image. And it actually gets this from Apple's developer documentation. And if you want to see even more information about images, then here at the bottom, we can just click Open in Developer Documentation. And then it opens that up for us, and this first part is the same, but down here it gives us even more information about images, like all the different ways we can create or initialize a new image, creating a system symbol image, creating an image from another image, and a bunch more. Now, when it comes to the Apple documentation, especially if you're a beginner, I want to just kind of warn you to not try to read through this and understand everything right now. The documentation wasn't really written for beginners. I'm just kind of showing you what Xcode provides so that as you get more and more comfortable with Swift and SwiftUI and developing iOS apps, you'll know about these extra resources that are available. But for now, let's get out of the documentation and come back to our project. So that's our Quick Help Inspector. We have our Accessibility Inspector, and then our Attributes Inspector. And just like with our Quick Help Inspector, this one depends on what we have selected in our code. So right now we're still on image, so we can see the attributes of our image. But let's click on our text. The Attributes Inspector changed, and now it's showing the attributes and the possible attributes of our text view. And this is really cool because when you change the attributes over here in the inspector, it updates the code automatically for that view. So let's try something. Let's just set this color here to like purple. And then notice over here in the code, it just added this line. This didn't used to be here. And also, if you've got your preview running, you can see that the text color changed to purple. So that's the Attributes Inspector. It's pretty fun to play with. So go ahead and test that out and try out some more of these settings. But for me, I'm mostly going to be just typing the code out right in the code area. So I'm going to mention my limited screen space one more time and use that as my reason to just go ahead and close this inspector panel completely. And you just do that by clicking this button right here at the top right, hide or show the inspectors. And that's the end of our Xcode tour. Now we didn't cover everything. Xcode is a huge application that does tons of stuff, and we'll be seeing a lot more as we go, and I'll just explain more about the different features as we need them. But for now, let's finally get going on our app. And the only thing I really want to do in this lesson is just bring in our app icon and our other images to the project. So over here in the Project Navigator, let's click on Assets. And like I said before, this is where we'll add our app icon and our other image assets to the project. Now for the app icon, I actually want my Attributes Inspector open. So hopefully you have enough screen space to keep yours open, but if you closed it like I did, then click that button again to open that up. And make sure we're on the Attributes Inspector. And there's a couple things. One is Appearances. And there's Any and Dark and Tinted. Now these are all here because Apple added the ability in iOS 18 to set your iPhone home screen to dark mode or a certain tint, like tint all your app icons a certain color. And so these options are just here for us as developers to give a custom app icon design in those cases if we want to. Otherwise though, Apple will just kind of take care of the dark mode and the tinting of your app icons. So I'm going to let them handle it. And I'm going to change this to none. So we only have to provide one app icon. And then the other setting I want to point out is this iOS single size. You can change that to all sizes, and again it's kind of similar. It's for if we want to give a different icon design for the different sizes where our icon might show up. And again, for this course, I think we're just good with one, so just single size. And you don't need to worry about creating an app icon for this app because I already created one. So if you haven't done it yet, on the course page on this lesson, there's a resources file that you can download. So go ahead and download that, and then let's unmaximize this here, and then open up that resources folder. And this is where you'll find the app icon and the images for this project. And we have this Exchange info file that we'll use later. But for now, let's kind of put this somewhere we can do this. And first, let's just drag that app icon into this spot here. Good. And then open up the images folder and select all these and drag them in here. And I'm going to close the inspector panel again too. So now we have all of our project resources pulled in. So let's go back to our content view. Now you might be looking at this mostly blank white screen and thinking, it's going to take a lot of time and effort to go from this to this, our finished app. But with SwiftUI, laying out the views and building a design like this takes just a few minutes. We're not going to get started on that until the next lesson, so for now, take some time and really get comfortable with Xcode. Check out the different panels and options, try that attributes inspector again, and then when you're ready, you can move on to the next lesson where we start building our app. In this lesson, we created our new Xcode project using SwiftUI as our main design interface, and I showed you how to sign into Xcode with your Apple ID. Then we did a tour of Xcode to get comfortable with the panels and tools we'll be using throughout the project. During the tour, we took a look at the app preview and talked about the benefits of seeing our app design in real time as we build it. We also went into our project build settings and enabled Swift 6 mode. And finally, we added our app icon and image assets to the project. Now, this being the first lesson, I want you to know that as you go through this course, please feel free to give me any comments or questions or feedback that you have. I really want to make sure this course is actually helpful to all my students, and that you're really learning the stuff. So yeah, please leave those comments if you have them, ask questions if there's anything you need help on, and I'll do my very best to make sure you get what you need. In the next lesson, we're going to start laying out our overall design using SwiftUI. And we're going to learn all about Z-stacks, V-stacks, and H-stacks, which are the basic building blocks of SwiftUI views. So I'll see you in the next lesson.